So it is January 24th, 2022, and this is part one of the interview with Dr. Petryshyn for the Local Narratives Project. And part one of this interview will focus on Dr. Petryshyn's background and family life. So to begin, could you please describe the third wave of immigration to Canada as you have come to understand it?
Yes, I think it's important to realize that in the literature and in the lives of the people concerned, the third wave of immigration starting after World War II, 1947, 48, 49, into about 1955, considered itself a political immigration. These were refugees who were fleeing the Soviet forces who had returned back into Western Ukraine in 1945. And this immigration, to a large extent, were the people whom the Soviets, after Germany was defeated, among over 2 million people in Europe, and particularly Germany at the end of the war, most of whom were persuaded by the Soviets to return to Ukraine. But about 250,000 Ukrainians, displaced persons, refugees, chose not to return, were essentially anti-Soviet, and preferred to emigrate and to foreign countries in Europe, North and South America, rather than return to their own homes. The feeling against the Soviet Union at the time by the Ukrainians was very pronounced, because the people in Western Ukraine, particularly in Galicia, Volyn, Bukovina regions of Western Ukraine, had seen the Soviets when they first arrived in Ukraine in 1939. Under the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement, Poland was divided between the two powers, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union occupied what was Eastern Poland and the provinces I mentioned, with the result that the population was, there were arrests, there were deportations to Siberia, there were physical punishment, tortures, there were executions. And in 1939, that experience in what was then Eastern Poland, or what was also earlier known as Western Ukraine, that experience was so terrorizing that those people who the Soviets considered bourgeois elite or nationalists or Democrats or Western agents, those people could not return home, because had they done so, many of them would immediately have been deported to Siberia or summarily executed. And this population was aware of that from their 1939 experience, and so chose to emigrate. From a Canadian perspective, the emigration after World War II was the so-called third immigration. There having been an immigration of 160,000 people prior to World War I, an immigration of about 60,000 between the two wars in the 1920s. And so this immigration after World War II was so-called third immigration. And it was comprised of approximately 35,000 people. Among them, one could imagine there being 10,000 couples. In other words, 20,000 of the 35. I'm just guesstimating these numbers for the sake of discussion. But we could imagine that in Canada, about 10,000 families were started between the late 40s and 1955, 56. So those families, 10,000 couples, let's call them, may have produced, let's say, between 10 or 15,000 children. So I am at the front end of that wave of second generation children, 10 to 15,000 children of Ukrainian refugees born in Canada or born abroad and educated in Canada. Some of them, like myself, I was born in 1946, and I was born in a displaced persons camp. And initially my family, absolutely, as I'll explain later, could not return. My parents could not return to Western Ukraine. And because of my parents' father, and particularly political activities. And by being born in 1946, I'm at the front end of a wave that probably ended in the mid-1950s, wave of births. So I was born in 1946 in Germany, but in 1949, I was already in Canada as a 2.5-year-old, 3-year-old, let's say. And so all of my education was in Canada. I vaguely remember being a child in a camp, but not really, because at the age of, maybe some people can remember that age, but I can only remember little snippets and the stories that were told subsequently around the table. But so there are likely at least 10,000 young people, the second generation of this refugee wave, their children, that was born and educated in Canada. And so my experiences are similar to the experiences of these, let's call them 10,000 other Ukrainian Canadians who were born immediately after the war, and for whose families the war, the trauma of war, was a major factor in their family life. And each one of these families, no doubt, every individual has stories to tell of bombing, of military occupation, of fear, of terror, of insecurity, of lack of everything, of life necessities, and the stresses of war. That leaves a mark on an entire generation. And not only the people who went through it, but also on their children. So although these children are raised in Canada, the stories they heard around the kitchen table, and when their parents would meet with their friends and so on, the stories they listened to had a tremendous amount to do with the war experience, which was central to their lives. The refugee first generation or third immigration, let's say, refugees. So this requires me to say a little bit about my parents in a historical framework, because in order for me to explain the influences of my life, I, I need to say a little bit about my father and mother's lives so that you begin to get context that they grew up in, which influenced my personal life. Understanding why my family in Canada was the way it was is the basis of the motivations that I acquired and developed and pursued in my own life, which were validated by experiences in Canada. Many of the things I heard in my family simply didn't exist in Canadian life. Like Canadian life and my Ukrainian life were two different worlds. And I was faced with this meeting, what would there be, could I integrate the two? Many of my generation could not, but in my case, my curiosity and my persistence at trying to understand my own parents and their roots over time began to fit in with Canadian life as Canadians began to understand more and more and more about Eastern Europe. Because in the 1930s and 1940s in Canada, this was the age of the radio, but it was not the age of mass public air travel. There were no computers. Letter writing was the way one communicated with family and so on. And so I heard stories at home, and I believed them, even though they weren't validated by my external Canadian environment until some time passed. And as the world got smaller through air travel, television communication, and computerization, and so on, Eastern Europe now is not far away at all. And so Canadians are much more, when I say Canadians, I mean by that university professors, political leaders, all kinds of institutions, civil society. Today, Canadians know much more about Eastern Europe. And in that process of this happening in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, it turned out my parents were telling me the truth. Even though the stories that I heard were so dramatic and so political and ideological, but there truly was a world conflict, which I began to see during the Cold War period. And then I saw with the Soviet invasion of Hungary, 1956, I already remember that historical event. Certainly in 1968, when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, I was already a student involved in those kinds of questions. So Canadian life sort of caught up with my family life. And I realized that the stories I was told were true at home and honest. I've validated that. It validated the stories. And so of course, I believed my parents and so on, but as this validation happened in Canadian society, it began to form part of my attitude and identity as a Canadian. So to really get at this, we will need to begin by dealing with my individual lives of my parents before they met each other and got married.
Excellent. So could you begin to discuss your parents, your mother and father, and what regions of Ukraine they were born in and grew up in, if they received a post-secondary education, what jobs their families were involved in, and some experiences that they shared with you about their experience in Ukraine and perhaps about the war?
Okay, well, let me begin maybe by my father, who really is formative in my life. My mother is as well. They're both. I had a very warm, loving relationship with my parents. In hindsight, I understand that that was caused in some respects because they had to leave their extended families back in Ukraine, and so they were alone. Unlike other immigrants, for example, my wife's family, there were immigrants that came in the second wave of immigration, 1930s. The Petryshins did not have family members who came in the 1920s. And so when my father Alexander or Olexa Petryshyn and my mother Stefania decided to emigrate, they relied on friends rather than on family in Canada. As it happened, they did have friends, which I'll talk about a little bit later, who facilitated their coming to Canada, although we were originally intended to go to Australia. But they did choose Canada in the end. And so let me start by saying my father, who is so central to my life, was born in 1919. And in 1919, the Western Ukrainian Republic had emerged in Galicia, and Austrian armies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had Ukrainian divisions known as Sichivistri. And that army supported the emergence of a government under President Petryshyn. And my father was born under an independent Ukraine. And so for him, 1919 meant that Ukraine was independent, and that in his early youth, that independence was lost to Poland when his region of Galicia, by the Entente and the Paris Peace Accords, was assigned to the newly re-emerged Polish state, which had been dismembered prior to World War I. And so he was born in it's not a village, and it's not a big town. It's in between a large village and a small town, a place called Koropets, which is in the today's province or oblast of Ternopil. And it's a hilly area. It has a creek running through it, and it's a very old town. I'll call it a town, a small town, with a river running through it. And the river had the fish called korop. And so that's why the town is called Koropets, after the fish. And there's a monument to the fish outside the town. It's a beautiful place, very attractive, and the small river goes into a small creek through the town, goes through a larger river, and the river is called the Chirimosh. And so It's a place where people have plots of land and farmed and so on. Now, my father had two brothers, and he was the youngest of the three. So his older brother actually was involved in the military activities of the Ukrainian army during World War I. And he was like an organizer in the town. Petro was his name, Petryshyn. And he was very active in the Prosvita movement, and was a maker of musical instruments and carriages, you know, these fancy carriages where people had in the old days. And and a musician and leader of the choir and so on. So he was an activist in the town of Koropets, and he was the influence on my father. And later, when my father in his teenage years became very political, it's because of Petryshyn. So as you can see, there is a generational influence in the family, in my father's family, for leadership and the defense of the idea of an independent Ukraine. Now this was, if my father was born in 1919, he started becoming active as a teenager. So let's say 10 years later, in 1929, he's 10 years old. But five years later, that is 1934, he's now 15. And by 1939, when the Soviets first arrived, after striking their deal with Nazi Germany to divide Poland, he was 20 years old. So my father, at the age of 20, was very engaged in politics, and had already been so for a number of years as a teenager. He described to me, for example, how he was roped into distributing leaflets sort of in the middle of the night in the town against the Polish regime, and had been arrested on a couple of occasions by the Polish police for illegal political activity. Now here I'll just say a little bit for those who don't understand the context. Poland had been broken up as a country prior to World War I. It didn't exist, but the Polish minorities in Russia, in Austria, Austro-Hungary, had memories of their own country previously. And they had not only working class populations, they also had their own bourgeoisie and political leadership, and a tradition of aristocracy in English terms, a szlachta. And so when Poland reestablished itself, and I won't go into this, if anybody is interested in this period, there is a very good book, which I'm just going to point out to you. It's written in English. It's been translated. It was written in the 30s, 1930s, after these events, but only translated into English a decade or so, less than a decade ago, by Vasyl Kuchabsky, Kuchabsky. It's published by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies here in Edmonton. And the book is called Western Ukraine in Conflict with Poland and Bolshevism, 1918-1923. So this is the book I'm referring to here. If anybody wants to understand more about how Poland reemerged, this is one of the better books in my view in English, because there's not a large literature in English about this, although there is obviously in Polish and Ukrainian and Russian and so on, but in English, a smaller literature available. But this book describes how Poland persuaded the United States and Britain that it should be reconstituted and recognized as a state during the Paris Peace Accord, but a state built on Polish memory of how Poland used to be. Now, in the 1700s, Poland included the entire west bank of the Dnipro River. In other words, all of central Ukraine to the city of Kyiv belonged to Poland, or the Empire of Poland, let's call it. And so the memory of their earlier Poland was reflected in what the Poles at the Paris Peace Accord discussions, they argued for the inclusion of large parts of the Lithuanian population, a large part of the Belarusian population, and the Ukrainian population from Galicia and Volyn into Poland. The result was that Poland, between First and Second World War, became a multinational state. And there were, this book will give you the exact figures in terms of population, but there were certainly 3 or 4 million Ukrainians living in Eastern Galicia, as opposed to Western Galicia, both of which were incorporated into Poland. And there were 2 huge populations of Belarusians and Lithuanians. And now the Polish state was very impoverished as a result of World War I, and unstable, and politically unstable because of these large populations who were unhappy with being included in Poland. At least there were strong oppositions to that agreement entente. In the eyes of my father and so on, and his generation, the Rzeczywistość, who had become, after the collapse of Austro-Hungary, and became the army of the Western Ukrainian Republic, fought well for an independent Ukraine, but were defeated. And many of whom were then incarcerated in Polish prisoner of war camps. I'm going to not to get into this detail because, as I say, I'm trying to come back to my father, but I need to explain that he and his generation felt that the defeat of the Western Ukrainian Republic was a failure that they needed to correct. And that democracy, as promoted by Wilson and others, was not the ideology to be repeated, because the first round of relations with Poland during the war, because both Poland and Ukrainians were part of Austro-Hungary, Poland managed to continue to dominate. And the Paris Peace Treaty Accords also put Poland in that position, with the result that in my dad's town, the government or the city town council and the area where the Ukrainian population was perhaps 80% or more ethnically, but the people who ran the town, who formed the police, were Polish. And on top of that, the new government of Poland gave land in their region to the soldiers of the Polish army, who then colonized this Ukrainian area. And so these Polish colonizers who were given land, and the Polish administration and the Polish police, army, and in the 1930s, there was a Polish action of what was called pacification, where the resistance of the Ukrainians to Polish dominance was physically dealt with by armed soldiers, and people were beaten, and again, violence, Ukrainian properties were burnt, and in return, of course, the Ukrainian resistance burnt Polish properties. And this resistance began to grow underground. And although there was an official parliament, and there were official Ukrainian political parties, democratic parties in the parliament, at the local level, where Polish colonists appeared and where Polish police appeared, young people like my father became politicized and struggled against the Polish regime. At the same time, in Ukraine proper, in the 1920s, there was a Soviet Ukrainian government, and it became established in the Constitution of the USSR. And for a number of years, there was a process of Ukrainianization, which was progressive in that it provided education, recognized the Ukrainian language. On the other hand, Soviet communism destroyed the churches. It was atheistic, destroyed the notion of private property, of people owning their land. It also created a Holodomor, which today is understood finally by the world and Canadians and political scientists and so on. But was not understood at the time because it was hidden by the Soviet regime. And yet, in my father's village, his brother Petro, as the leader, sort of a cultural leader in town, my father told me as a youngster about the famine and how his brother hung the black flag on the Prosvita. So I could imagine listening to him the story of the meetings that took place at the Prosvita condemning the Holodomor. And I won't say a lot much more about this, but except to say that the famine genocide in Ukraine that the Soviet government perpetrated on people for political reasons, about which there is now a very large literature, but was not available in English in the 30s or 40s or 50s. Even in the 60s, the Ukrainian community spoke about these events, but they were not recognized at the university or in history books or literature. But these things were all talked about to me as a youngster, and that my father experienced as a youngster. And they were very real. And he explained how people tried to help send food, how the border was closed, how, there were, particularly through the Volyn border, there were people who went back and forth. So there was real live people who experienced this famine genocide. And so the Soviet Union was attractive to the communist movement in Western Ukraine and had proof of the usefulness of the communist revolution in the 1920s when Ukraine Ukrainianized. However, when Stalin took control of the party, the national question took a different line, and Stalin repressed nations inside the Soviet Union. And so people like my uncle Petro and my father were not only against the Polish regime for the reasons I outlined, that they were against Soviet communism. So this too was a concept that affected my father as a young man, and his experience with the Soviets in 1939 when they first came was discussed in my family around the table. My father in 1939 was 20 years old, already politically active as a teenager, as I've described. He was in the underground and conspiratorial, and he saw the Soviets. He interacted with them. And it didn't take long before, after a few months, that, the message came through for him that he was on a list and that he had to disappear, and which he did. Now, when they did come looking for him, he was gone. And in true Soviet style, people, military that came to arrest him said, "We're looking for Petryshyn." and everybody in the family of the house, which I eventually visited this property and saw this place. He said, he's not here. We don't know where he is. And in fact, they said, in that case, we will take Petryshyn. The name is Petryshyn. If we don't have Alexa, we have to fill our quota. We're arresting his older brother. And so Petryshyn was arrested and ended up 10 years in Siberia with his wife and kids who were born there and so on. And he did not return until after the war. In our family, we experienced a struggle against the Polish regime and the struggle against the Soviet regime. And these stories came down to me. And there was just the three of us, my mother, my father, and I. My sister wasn't born until 1960. And so I only understood that we had a much larger family through the discussions at the table. So my father would talk about his older brother, who I've already described his experience. His middle brother had actually, during the Soviet occupation, 1939, well, he joined up with the Polish army once Poland was attacked. So actually the middle brother served in the Polish armed forces. And but when the Soviets came, the Polish army was gone, was destroyed. In fact, the Soviets deported several 100,000 people from this region of Western Ukraine to Siberia between 1939 and 1941. And during the Soviet period, my older brother opened a store to sell my middle cousin, my middle uncle, Petro, and this uncle, the middle one opened his this meat store to sell meat to people, and the Soviets simply imposed a tax on him and drove him out of business. There were to be no private stores anymore. In Poland, of course, Poland was a capitalist society, and one could have privately owned shops, selling products that people bought and earning a profit, but that was not to be the case under the Soviet. And so these are the kinds of stories that were told to me. And on my father's side. Now, we emigrated to Fort William because one of my father's close friends, a gentleman named by Markiewicz, who eventually settled here in Edmonton, sponsored my family, invited us, and helped, through letters with information and correspondence, and helped us to come to Canada. We were scheduled for Australia, but as a 2-year-old, I got scarlet fever. And this is a contagious disease. And so our family had to miss the Australian boat. And so I'm forever, let's say, grateful that we ended up in North America as opposed to Australia, because it's closer to to Europe, and the Ukrainian community, of course, had roots in Fort William from before World War I, very large roots, and many thousands of Ukrainians. Thunder Bay is on Lake Superior, or what's called, Lake Head. In other words, it's the top of the Great Lakes, and one traveled either by rail or by boat to Fort William, and so the community had large roots there, and people who emigrated in the first wave before World War I, a number of them stopped in Fort William. And there's a sister city nearby called Port Arthur. And Fort William actually had a west end called West Fort. So it was like 3 small towns, which eventually amalgamated and today is called Thunder Bay. But in those times when one traveled by horse and so on, and of course there were, by the 1940s and 50s, there was a bus and so on connecting the towns, but ownership of cars were far and few between. Even as a kid, I remember that not everybody could own a car, although the number was quickly increasing in the 50s and 60s. Everybody could own a car, because after the war, salaries were high for working people compared to the way they are today. Working people, the middle class has been squeezed in the last 50 years, whereas in the 1950s, the middle class was growing. So Markevich has helped us, and because of my father's politics, he was aligned with the Legacies, and the organization that had been created in Canada was called the Ukrainian National Federation, UNF, and he was sponsored by a member of the UNF, and so the family came to Fort William and became active members right away in the Ukrainian National Federation. So I was raised at home with my culture, Ukrainian culture. But as a child, I can remember my father babysitting me, obviously, but going to meetings. And so I can remember going to meetings and not understanding what's going on and so on. But I understood that there was a lot of people that were talking about things. And all of a sudden, we would go to a concert. There was a choir. And pretty soon I was going to Ridna Shkola. And at first there was a Ridna Shkola at Ukrainian National Federation Hall. There was a hall already built, and by the time we arrived. So we just fit into an already existing community that had been created by the first and second wave of immigrants. Now, this hall was created in the 1930s by Sichovi Streltsy, who emigrated to Canada after the war with Poland, and some of whom had been interned and so on. And so I met them. I met soldiers who fought in the for the Western Ukraine government. And one of them owned a store, Mr. Petryshyn, I remember, at the store where they sold candies and stuff. And My father would give me 10 cents and I'd buy stuff at the store and I'd talk to them in Ukrainian. And then I'd be at the hall and that was in Ukrainian. And we'd go to a concert and that was in Ukrainian. And then later on at the school, and then when the UNF amalgamated its school with Prosvita, that was another organization created before we arrived. And there was a Prosvita, 3 of them in the area. There's one in Westfort, one in Fort William, and one in Port Arthur. So for me, Ukrainian life was already an institutionalized community. And it's quite normal for people to speak Ukrainian, to be talking about the war, to be making plans to raise funds for this or that campaign. So for example, when I was a student at Prosvita, there was a thing called the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, and now it's called the Congress, Ukrainian Canadian Congress. So we had a branch of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, it was called at the time, which united all of the organizations in these 3 areas. And one of them was the Ukrainian Canadian Social Services. So as a young person, when the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, that we had a fundraiser, and all the young people were asked to help in the fundraising campaign because we all spoke English. And for example, I can remember going to Safeway and standing outside the door with a little box in front of me, and saying, we had these little ribbons, blue and yellow ribbon with a pin through it. Would you like to make a donation to the Ukrainian Canadian Social Services? And people say, yeah, and they throw in, a couple of quarters or whatever for this young kid. And so, we had all these young people and older people with us as well, all over the town, all 3, the big town, the 3 towns. And we would collect money for Ukrainian Canadian Social Services. And this would be given, for example, it would be, some of this money would help people locally, but some would be sent to veterans of World War II and World War I in Europe who had lost limbs, were disabled in various ways and could not emigrate or could not look after themselves. There were institutions in Europe that helped these veterans. And so for me, it was all an educational process, a living process. These were real people with real life experiences who were doing real things. And it was not an abstraction. It was not, it was driven from below. It was the actual belief of people that that we should do this, and then the idea of government giving a grant or something simply didn't exist. And at those times, that kind of, this was all done by the private sector. Government would never dream of giving money to one of these immigrant communities, refugee communities. The government did provide English language classes. It did, did facilitate the travel and so on for immigrants. But people were on their own with their sponsors. If you got a letter from a sponsor, that person's supposed to help you. And they did. In the case of my family, any other Ukrainian Canadians, they were helped by the already existing Ukrainian institutions created by the first wave and their 2 generations of children, and by the second wave and their 1 generation of children, if you see what I mean. The community numbers of volunteers was huge. The Ukrainian community at the time still spoke in Ukrainian. Minutes of meetings were taken in Ukrainian. That changed in my lifetime. Minutes started using English, and now pretty well every Ukrainian organization in Canada write their minutes in English. There are exceptions, but at the time, I'm just pointing out that the Ukrainian language was used in a variety of environments, in the church, in the hall, in the school, and so on. So the community was a living entity. And now, what I've described for you so far in Thunder Bay are churches and the national community, those people who supported the independence of Ukraine, the Western Ukrainian Republic, and then during the war, we'll talk about that subsequently. And my parents and others continued to talk about independence Ukraine, even though with 1945, the region my parents came from, Galicia, and another region called Volyn and so on, were taken by the Soviet Union and attached to Soviet Ukraine. So the Ukrainian territories of the Western Ukrainian Republic and the Ukrainian National Republic in central Ukraine, they had been united symbolically during the independence struggle. The Soviet, under Stalin, actually physically incorporated the Western Ukraine and its population into the Soviet Republic, united Ukraine. So despite all of Stalin's negative history in the Holodomor and in the destruction of the Ukrainian national movement, he did unite Ukraine. And that eventually, in modern times, 1991, became an independent Ukraine because of what was done in the period earlier. In this earlier period, that is prior to World War I and after World War I, it was not the national Democrats that were in the majority. Necessarily, Ukrainian Canadians had established a social democratic movement that had been led by figures such as Ivan Franko, and there was created, I think in 1905, a Ukrainian Social Democratic Party in Canada. So that movement, after the Soviet Union was created, became a strong supporter of the communist movement in Canada. That is to say, Ukrainian Canadians and their organization, some of the Ukrainian Canadians and their organization, a substantial portion of the population, became supporters of the Communist Party of Canada. And they were very active in, along with other communities, such as in the Jewish community and the Finnish community, they were very active in the communist movement. Now, this was the character of Fort William and Port Arthur and what is today Thunder Bay. This was a working class town with paper mill, iron ore, railway, at the head of the lakes where grain was stored, shipping, fishing, and so on. So these were working class towns, and the labor movement, as well as the communist movement, were both very prevalent in today, then Fort William. So 2 blocks down from the Ukrainian National Federation, was the Ukrainian Labor and Farmer Temple, which was a 2-story brick building, bigger than the Ukrainian National Federation Hall that I went to. They, in fact, were the majority Ukrainian movement in the town I grew up in. And so at a very early age, I became aware during the Cold War, which is in the 50s, I became very aware of the notion that you can be Ukrainian, but not a supporter of an independent Ukraine. Instead, you could be a supporter of Soviet Ukraine. And these two visions, an independent Ukraine, which was in the abstract, and a Soviet Ukraine, which is a real place with real borders and a real government, well, a Soviet government, not because real power was held by the Soviet government in Moscow, but provincial powers were held by Soviet Ukrainian government, as they were in 14 other republics, in Belarus and so on. But I became aware, sensitized to the notion that there was a labor movement, a communist movement to be more precise, that my father was against. Now, his anti-communism came from 1939 when he met people from the Red Army in his town. And they're the people he fled from. So people in the labor movement at the time, of course, had a picture of Stalin up in the temple, labor temple. And Stalin was, of course, the leader of the Soviet Union, who was an ally of Canada's and liberated Europe from Nazism, helped, and certainly from Eastern Europe. So this was the Canadian point of view, that Stalin was a liberator, a hero, whereas in my family, Stalin was the person who sent my uncle to Siberia, and in 1939 came looking to arrest my father. And so it was clear that my family was anti-Soviet, but it was not entirely clear to me what the depth of the matter was. I realized it was a big historical issue, a conflict at a world level. And this began to pique my curiosity. What law lies behind all of this? And of course, it led me to begin to read and to begin to try to understand this community we had that was not of the third wave. I began to take an interest because I went to school at Prosvita. So I became aware that Prosvita was a movement from before World War I, Ukrainianizing movement, an educational movement. I had reading clubs. People were illiterate. There were reading clubs in Canada. They bought newspapers, they published newspapers, books. But at the same time, Prosvita was in favor of an independent Ukraine. So it began to lead me to realize that one needed to distinguish the ideological commitments different groups had. And this inevitably carried over into the religious world. My parents both were Catholic. Now, we called ourselves Ukrainian Greek Catholic. And again, I couldn't, in my younger years, quite understand how one could be both Greek and Ukrainian. And then I discovered that there were Orthodox. But in my town, we had one Orthodox church related to central Ukraine, and another one called themselves Bukovinian Orthodox. So this began to make me realize that Ukrainian Christianity had at least three currents. It had this Ukrainian, let's call it Greco-Catholic tradition. It had an Orthodox tradition from Central and Ukraine and Bukovina. And in time, I came to realize there was a Protestant tradition. Now, we didn't have a Protestant church in Thunder Bay, but when I started reading, I realized there was the Stundist movement in, from Germany, immigration to Ukraine, and that there had been a Protestant movement in Ukraine, and a German immigration settled in Ukraine. It suddenly created for me an understanding of a very complex picture of Ukraine. And my father, whenever I asked questions, he explained these things to me. He didn't necessarily give me books to read. Like, we didn't have a huge library, or, I guess we couldn't afford such a library, or immigrant refugee family. It took quite a while just to purchase a house and pay off the mortgage, and and so on. And but he is the one who gave me answers, and if I wanted to know more, pointed me to the library and encouraged me to read, as did my Canadian English-speaking school to read. In fact, I favored English reading over Ukrainian reading. Ukrainian reading was not easy for me because I was, I had a language that I heard from my parents, but I didn't necessarily read at a high level of proficiency. I attended Ukrainian school at Prasvita. I think we took 6 or 8 years of Ukrainian school, something of that order. And then I also attended what are called kursy Ukrainoznavstva, or summer courses, where people like me showed up from various cities, and we heard more in depth. And this was through the UNF system, the Ukrainian National Federation system. These courses were held in the 1960s by the UNF system and the Ukrainian Museum in Winnipeg. So at any rate, there was no Plast in Thunder Bay, and there was no SUM at the time. That a SUM eventually appeared. In the later 50s, early 60s, although the Ukrainian National Federation existed, another organization popped up, and it was called the League for the Liberation of Ukraine. And again, for reasons that I didn't fully understand, my father did not he cooperated with them, but did not send me there. Each of these organizations, the UNF and the League for the Liberation of Ukraine, had a men's organization, a women's organization, and a youth organization. They paralleled each other, mirrored each other. And this was true, by the way, of the Labor and Farmer Temple. They also had that structure. And it's probably is why our immigration, the third wave, also had that kind of structure. And the youth organization that the League created was called Союз Української молоді, and SUM, S-U-M. Now, there was an Orthodox youth organization I discovered that was called SUMK, with a K on the end. But that was associated with the Orthodox Church, whereas SUM was associated with the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church. So it was a rich environment for me to grow up in. I not only heard about the national question and national liberation and Ukrainian independence, I heard about communism and the communist movement and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Labor and Farmer Temple. And then when I went to university, I discovered there's a Finnish communist movement in Port Arthur, and that they have a history of working with the Ukrainians, as did the Jewish community in the communist movement. So I realized that Thunder Bay is truly a multicultural society with a variety of ethnic organizations in which there was political leadership that was tied to world events. Some groups were oriented to communism. Some groups were oriented to democracy. Some groups were oriented to fascism. And all of those things were percolating among the people of Thunder Bay and their kids. Now, the kids, just as I didn't fully grasp what is going on, the second generation of each of these communities, Finnish, Jewish, and so on, Italian, didn't understand their parents either very well. Certain things they understood, of course. They understood the ethnic things, the cultural things. They understood ethnic food. Like when I visited my Italian friends, they served me spaghetti and gave me a cheese. And I can remember smelling it and say, ooh, that really smells. I don't want to eat that. Well, today I pay, $30 for 100 grams of this cheese because I finally understood the quality of the food I was being served by Billy Belluz and his parents, But as a young 7-year-old or 8-year-old, I discovered multicultural food. Just as I would have Wayne Teixeira from the Italian community come over, and my mother would make Ukrainian food, and we became good friends. And so he understood Ukrainian ethnic food. And so it was with music. People, you learn something about these other groups, and you not a lot, but you would realize that they have a different history. Now, in my case, I was fortunate that my father already had a tradition of activism, and so he took on leadership in community organizations. For example, he was very active in the Ukrainian Credit Union that was formed in Fort William. He was the secretary. He always liked to be the secretary. And and he was a volunteer at the credit union for a dozen years as the secretary. And the same at the UNF, or UNO, we called it in Ukrainian. He was the secretary or vice president and so on, but it's only on occasion that he would agree to become the president. So he took on the presidency of KUK, the Ukrainian Canadian Committee at the time, at one point. But there were other people that took on the leadership, many of whom were Ukrainian Canadian born already, who took on the leadership of the UNF. He came to an institution already formed with a Canadian Ukrainian leadership. And so he took on secondary roles, but he was active in a wide range of organizations. And not only that, he got a wide range of newspapers coming to the house from various countries in Europe and South America. So it was common for me to see the Ukrainian newspaper for Brazil or the Ukrainian newspaper for Poland. This was an everyday occurrence with the photographs, and I checked the photographs. I'd read articles about what Ukrainians are doing in Brazil and what they're doing. And I would go to meetings of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. I would hear about this umbrella group and how it talks to the government of Canada and how. So for me, it was a normal state of affairs to have a series of institutions which cooperated together and represented the community and did things together. So for example, when we celebrated the Canada Centennial and the 100th anniversary, I was already, what was it, 1967? So I was 20. And it became natural for me to take leadership. I was had been in these youth groups. I knew what the Ukrainian Committee was. And so I realized that as Ukrainians, it should be the UCC that should represent us during Centennial Year. And in Fort William and Thunder Bay, there was to be a big parade, a Centennial parade. Well, it was yours truly who organized a committee to make a float, representing the Ukrainian, a big sign, Ukrainians of Thunder Bay and so on. But I came up with this idea that we would make paper flowers, and take a flatbed truck, a flatbed, and there's wiring. There's this kind of wire that you sometimes use for a fence, and you can weave paper flowers onto this wire, right? And because they're little triangles, these wire fence, little triangles. Well, this is the perfect background on which to weave Ukrainian embroidery. So I proposed to the UCC that we have all the people in all the organizations in Thunder Bay make paper flowers and then put them on this flatbed trailer and make like a decoration, like a Ukrainian embroidery, right? And so it was natural for everybody to cooperate, and everybody did. And so I understood that the UCC was an important organization. It was our image, our face, our public engagement with all the other Canadians who also had floats, in this parade, as well as organizations like the Shriners or, the Elks and so on, who had floats that were not ethnic. But it was perfectly natural for us all in Thunder Bay to do this. So it was also natural for me to suggest during Centennial that we buy an insert in the Thunder Bay Chronicle, and 4 pages and describe our history in Canada as the Ukrainian communities, where we talked about all 3 waves and the achievements of Ukrainians in Canada and what organizations we have, and that this should be paid for by all the different organizations in the town. And people went for it. They kind of followed my lead. So those ideas began to formulate a world view for me. I realized that Ukrainian Canadians have a rightful place in Canada, but to earn the awareness by the general population of their existence, they have to work at it. And they have to create institutions not only that serve the Ukrainian community inside the community, but we have to create institutions that communicate outside the community to the general public. And so we published this 4-pager, and it became part of the history of Ukrainians in Thunder Bay. And if some archivist ever wants to dig out that centennial celebration of Thunder Bay, the evidence will be there to prove my contention on the kinds of things I was involved in at the time. Anyway, I also became active at the university and so on, and I'll describe that a little later on. But with respect to the formative sources of my Ukrainianism, they came from my family. They came from the organization that they joined and were helped to come to Canada. And so, we were very grateful and felt an obligation to help others. So this idea of benefiting, and once you've benefited, helping others, became part of the psychology I was raised in, as was the organization in that community that I was in. That is 3rd wave, 2nd generation. I'm a 3rd wave, 2nd generation. But those values I discovered are common to the 1st and 2nd wave, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation as well. So there is a basis on which this community is coordinated. Like we are a large and substantial part of the Canadian population, and in many ways misunderstood. People, the general Canadian population, didn't understand the internal dynamics of our community. And yet there were, not everybody was interested, but yet there are many Canadians who are interested. And in return, I was interested in them. And so at university, I pursued both psychology and sociology later on with that driving interest, all connected to a worldview that said, there are big issues like the Cold War, like communism, like invasions, like the independence of Ukraine, that I also had in this package of ideas that began formulating in my mind. So I could say more about my father, and probably will in other interviews in this series, but I wanted maybe to end my comments at this point with respect to his influence, and turn my attention now to my mother. And so Stefania Petryshyn, she comes from a family by the name of Zelinsky. And now Zelinsky, for Slavicists, will immediately recognize it's a Polish name. And my mother, the Zelinsky family, comes from an old town called Kote, along the Cheremosh River. And she was one of 11 children, unlike my father, by the way, whose mother died early in his life. I've neglected to mention that. So yeah, that's why he was so influenced by his older brother. He didn't want to live with his stepmother, and so he moved and lived with his older brother. That's why the influence was so profound. But Stefania Petryshyn grew up with a very large family, and the twins passed away early, so there were 9 siblings in her generation, 2 brothers and 7 sisters. And so these were all my aunts and uncles, and they sent a lot of letters to us because there were a lot of them there, and they needed help, of course. After the war, which destroyed, thousands of towns and villages in Ukraine and cities, the war was total in Ukraine, and people were desperate for any kind of assistance. So my parents, like all the Ukrainian Canadians in the third wave and many other Ukrainian Canadians, after World War II, were constantly sending packages of food, clothing, money over to Ukraine. Now, some of it was easier to do than others. Money initially got through, then the Soviet censorship used to open letters and steal the money. And people, I can remember my father taking $10 and wrapping it in we don't have them anymore, but if in the past, when you wanted 2 copies of something, you would type and you'd put a sheet, an ink sheet between the 2 pages. I forget what they called it.
Carbon paper.
What?
Carbon paper? Carbon copy?
Carbon copy paper, yeah. So he would wrap the $10 in one of these carbon copy papers, because when they checked letters on a light table, light would shine from the Soviet censorship. And our people talked about this among themselves. Yeah, the Soviet censors are using these light tables to look what's in the envelope. And so if they could see a $10 bill, which would be evident on a light table, they would open the envelope, take the money. These guys would steal it. So my father would wrap up $10, $20, whatever he would send, in a carbon paper, so the light couldn't penetrate. They couldn't see the money and wouldn't open the. Anyway, this is a small vignette of how life was like in those years. At any rate, my mother was born and raised in Kote, which is a place along the Cheremosh. Is beautiful. Grapes grow there. All kinds of vegetables, apples, cherries. It's when the Ukrainians in Canada talk about Ukraine being a beautiful place, they often are thinking about these kinds of places. It's really a place you want to see and visit, and it's hot in the summer and beautiful, and you go swimming in the Cheremosh. When my father and I went back in 1992, it took 47 years for him to get back to this town where he visited as a young 20-year-old. He went. One of the first things they wanted to do is to go for a swim in the Cheremosh River, because he had done that, 50 years or 47 years earlier, kind of thing. but it's a fast river at certain spots, so I had to pull him out because he wasn't managing the current. But that's neither here nor there. Memory of my father. At any rate, she was born. My mother, Stefania, was born with these two older brothers, and she was the oldest of the girls. And being the oldest, at roughly, that age of 12, 13, the family decided that she was to be sent to Koropets, where my father was raised. And she was sent there to assist her uncle, who was a Volchuk. Now, that is to say, my mother's mother, my grandmother from home, was a Volchuk. Now, my grandmother had a brother who was a priest. And in the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church. And he was assigned to a parish in Koropets. But a priest in Polish times had a legal status. The Polish government, because these were Catholics, and Poland was Catholic, Roman Catholic. But we were Ukrainian Greco-Catholics who had our own church hierarchy. We did not belong to the Roman Catholic Church. So in Koropets, they had a Ukrainian Catholic Church, but they also had a huge Polish Roman Catholic Church, one big church for all the Poles in the region. After Ukraine became independent, I went back to Koropets, and the Ukrainian Greco-Catholics have now built a church equal in size to the Roman Catholic Polish Church 50 years later. Anyway, and there are many fewer Polish Roman Catholics in Koropets now. Koropets is mostly Ukrainian Greco-Catholic. But anyway, so in the Reverend Volchuk, like all the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic priests, had a land assigned to the parish over which he managed. Now, what this land was used for is to feed the priest. Like they would plant gardens and so on this land, and to sustain the parish. But the priest didn't work the land, it's the parishioners who work the land. So there was this land, and I think even a little funding from the Polish government. And so priests were leaders in the Ukrainian community of the time, in all of Galicia. And so if you read about this period, you will discover that very often the children of these priests often became leaders of the Ukrainian democratic and nationalist underground, for example. And they were leaders because of the structure of Poland and the decisions on colonization, the decisions on to support the Ukrainian Catholic Church by the Polish regime, these created a new circumstances for the new generation to emerge. So you've already heard how that affected my father, but now I want to say a little bit of how it affected my mother, because her family decided that Reverend Wojciuk needed, he at the time I believe was not married yet, he needed someone in the house he lived in. And my mother, with a grade school education, a very limited education, was to be his supporter or his to look after the meals at his home, relations with the parishioners, women of the parish. She was, until he got married and so on, he didn't have that kind of assistance. And so my mother, being the oldest, was sent to live and work with him for a couple of years. And that's where she became quite expert at cooking, among other things, at gardening, and obviously, but she came with those skills as well from her family. But she transferred those skills, to support Reverend Wojciuk, who was her family. It was her uncle. She was going living with her uncle and helping him run his parish, is the way maybe to put it. And so now at the time there was a movement, a women's movement that emerged in Western Ukraine in the interwar period that was doing a lot of work to raise the let's say the home culture, how to cook nutritious food, how to serve food, how to purchase cutlery, because in generations prior, people made their own implements. They made the plow, they made the kitchen utensils, they made bowls and so on. This was the case in Canada as well. It's not as if Canada was in some way miles ahead of, or Prairie Canada miles ahead of Western Ukraine, not at all. But you had to have the money to purchase things that, clothing that was manufactured, not sewn, hand sewn, or, to purchase a sewing machine, or to purchase machinery, cutlery, knives for kitchens and so on. This was an issue in the 1920s and the 1930s, is that society was changing and the standards were rising, and there was a movement in women's movement in Western Ukraine that was promoting this. And so my mother was affected by this, and it affected her ability to do her work for Reverend Wojciuk and so on. And so it was not at all unusual for her to join an organization, and she learned to do this as a teenager, much the way that my father learned about music and singing in a choir as a teenager. On the other hand, whereas my father, though, was socialized by someone who experienced war and politics and so on, which was done by men, not exclusively. There were women involved in the Sichuvici, and they were, enrolled as officers and soldiers and so on. but these were exceptions rather than the general rule. Like, so it was in the women's movement. Not all women had an interest in politics. I mean, and that's the case today. Not all men nor all women have an interest in war or in politics. But in my family, on the male side, politics was deeply ingrained. On my mother's side, involvement in women's organizations and so on was deeply ingrained. However, as I mentioned, she was a Volchuk, and she went to the Ukrainian Catholic Church, not the Roman Catholic Church. However, the name of the family is Zelinsky. She was raised as a Zelinsky by her mother, my grandmother. And who was Zelinsky? Zelinsky was Polish. The name, to people of the time and place, the name said it all. If you were Zelinsky, you had a Polish dimension. But Reverend Wojciuk was not Polish. He was Ukrainian Catholic. And all the girls in a mixed family at that time in the 1930s would go to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And in a mixed Polish-Ukrainian family, the boys would go to the Roman Catholic Church, if they went to church at all, because there were many people who simply didn't go to church, right? And were supporters of socialist, communist, and social democratic movements and so on. But the people who were church-going in mixed families had, let's put it this way, a foot in both camps. Now, so my mother was raised as a Ukrainian. When I met my uncles, the first uncle I met after the war and after Ukrainian independence, 1976, when I traveled to Poland and the Soviet Ukraine, I first met my uncle who was living in Poland. And he was Polish. He had chosen to leave Ukraine. Well, he didn't choose, he were forced to leave. The Polish and the Soviet governments move people, but my uncle ended up in Poland. My other family ended up in Kute. On the female side, they ended up in Kute. On the male side, they, well, not all of them. One uncle was Kute, the other stayed in. As you can see, it's a confusing picture for Canadians and second, third generation to understand. But for them, it made perfect sense at the time that in a Polish state, a new Polish state, you could be Roman Catholic and aligned with the majority population in Warsaw and Krakow and so on. And my middle uncle even joined the Polish army. Whereas on the female side, my mother opted to join, or was in the Catholic Church and active with Ukrainian women's organizations. And when she started looking for a mate, if she was looking, or how it happened, I can't say exactly, or whether my father was looking for a mate, she ran across Alexander Petryshyn in the town of Koropets, where she was living in the parish building and looking after Otec Wojciuk. And so they hit it off and had a genuine, true love relationship that lasted to the end of their lives. They supported each other strongly, and I felt their relationship, and it's affected my own appreciation of family. It, it gave me a notion of how men properly relate to women, because my mother, although she was very gentle on the surface, was an extremely strong woman under the surface. And maybe I'll mention some things in the course of these recordings, but I can tell you that if she had to take risks, she did. If she had to suffer, she did. And if she had to survive, and in one case, she described to me when the Romanians, when the war broke out, the Romanian army was allied with the Nazi army. And so it was the Romanians that appeared in Kute. She was still a girl, young girl. But there was a lot of shooting going on. And the Soviets had dug ditches, anti-tank ditches in the town, and so there was an actual battle in the town, and so on. And my mother told me that she was curious at one point, and she just poked her head around a corner of a wall, and a bullet went whistling right past her face. So, some sniper was just waiting, and he didn't know who he was shooting at, I have no doubt, but it was this little girl, and she almost got it. And so it was, war immediately results in dead bodies lying in the streets, and blood and limbs, and bombs falling, and houses being destroyed, and flames, and danger at every turn. And she went through all of that. And she described for me, for example, and well, maybe I'll save this other example for later on, but bombing when they were fleeing. But they were on a train, and American bombers were bombing, and the train, was in danger of being hit. So the train stops. Everybody runs off the train into the woods, and you hide behind a tree. And so if the bombs explode, the shrapnel doesn't hit you. And so she describes these kinds of things, of the train stopping, fleeing, running. And, and this is not something just my family or she experienced. This was a experience of thousands of people throughout the war, of what it meant to be bombed, and seeing the bombs coming. You could literally see the bombs out of the airplanes, and they come, and then so you have no choice. Your life is so this is kind of the environment that she went through. And on the other hand, she met Alexander Alexa, and he courted her while she was helping Otec Wojciuk, and he would visit her and so on. And they got to know each other. And in 1943, they got married. And there is a picture in the middle of the war of the two of them. Of course, the wedding involved only a few people and so on. But it's what could be done in the middle of a war. So in 1943, they were at this parish in Koropets, and the war had turned. The Soviets had defeated the Nazis in the Far East, and they were moving to the West. Now, my parents, both as younger people, my mother was born in 1922, so she was 3 years younger than my father. So in 1939, when the Soviets came, my father was already 20-year-old with a political view and engaged in things. And my mother was 3 years younger, so she'd be 17, 18, sort of thing. So the two of them had to decide if they're staying or leaving. But my father had seen the Soviets and already fled from them once. And my mother never talked about the Soviets, so I don't know whether she understood the Soviet period. I'm afraid I never asked. Maybe I should have asked more, but you can only, there's only so many things I understood when I was a younger person as well. So at any rate, the two of them decided that they should flee. Of the photographs they had, quite a number were destroyed because, and the rest were buried in a glass jar. A few photographs, the wedding one. And when we went back in the 1990s, that popped up. So for the first time I saw the wedding, because throughout my life, they had told me the wedding, and there was a church document, but I had always wanted to see what the wedding looked like, especially when I was getting ready to get married myself. But you could not leave your photographs with other members of the family, because if they were interrogated or arrested, then they couldn't deny all knowledge of you. So by fleeing and not leaving pictures with your family, you are not encumbering them with an anti-Soviet family member. Now, this was very real from 1945, certainly right into, 1985. For example, my father not only did he not go back to visit, say in the 1980s, he did not even write letters to his family because of his previous political activity, and not knowing whether they knew where he was. And so he was not going to risk his family, and did not communicate directly. He communicated through my mother to his family, and through friends. And so by leaving, one was cutting ties. Now in 1940, in the early 1945, when they decided to leave and go west, they did not know where they're going. They decided that they would fill a couple of backpacks, rucksacks, and walk over the mountains into Slovakia. That meant going up. And now when you go to the top of a mountain, even in the springtime, it's snowy. And so that's what they did. They, the two of them, just took a rucksack and climbed the mountain, went down, up, down, and slept on the ground. And my mother described to me, my father described that, you know, he would just cut, break off a few branches off, evergreen trees and so on, and they would sleep on this ground and wake up, on snow, sometimes waking up with new snowfall, covered by snowfall. And of course, that later, when they got older, that later showed up with all kinds of arthritis and pain and all the rest of it. And then, so they made it. They crossed over to Slovakia. And the war is still on, remember? The war hasn't yet reached Lviv and so on. They're fleeing, or no, it's reached, or about to reach Lviv. And but he's living in the Chernivetska Oblast, which is Kute is right next to the Slovak and Romania, Slovakia and Romania. In that corner, they cross the Slovak border, and get a ride on a train to Bratislava. Now, in the war, every day is a question of where you get food and where you sleep. And so the Slovaks had arrangements, because there was a labor shortage. Everybody's at the front. The war is going on. So my father took labor work with a farmer. He sort of did farm work. And my mother, because of her cooking experience, became a cook in a hotel. In fact, the best hotel in the city of Bratislava, from which she could always liberate a few slices of bread and a little bit of meat and bring them home. And so she became a cook and improved her cooking at this hotel, because apparently it was an upscale hotel, and which had a trolley. She described to me how you would cook in the kitchen, and then you put it on a trolley and pull it, and it would go up to the dining room, kind of thing. So the two of them lived this way. But the Soviet army kept coming. And the Slovaks, you may or may not know, people don't know the history of these locations during the war, but the Slovakia, the western tip of Slovakia, which was then Czechoslovakia, the western tip, included a substantial number of Ukrainians. There's indigenous Ukrainians who have lived there for all time. And those people identified with Slovakia. They're ethnically Ukrainian, but they identified with the Slovaks, just like some of my uncles identified with Poland and others identified with Ukraine. So the ones in Slovakia identified with the Soviet Union and the Red Army. And they were looking, there was a strong feeling, which exists in some part to this day, of support for the Soviet Union by Ukrainians in Western Slovakia, where my father was working in a farm and my mother was in a hotel. Both of whom were fleeing the Red Army. So they're living in a pro-Soviet environment. And they decide it's time to leave. And so they get on a train. In fact, they say, I don't know if it's literally the case, but one of the last trains to leave Bratislava for southern Germany, and where people were heading, the immigration, millions of people were on the move. And there was, as I mentioned earlier, there were over 2 million Ukrainians estimated are heading west. Now, every one of them has a different story. I'm describing for you the story of my particular family, and in this case, my mother and father. The family back in Ukraine doesn't know this story until decades later, and until Ukraine becomes independent, and my mother visits Ukraine first after not seeing her mother and her sisters for 52, 53 years, something of that order. And that's when the stories are fully disclosed to our family, because they were no longer at risk in communist Soviet Union. So, and they retouched as older ladies. I met my grandmother as well. She was quite aged in her late 80s, and my mother sisters were all getting on, so to speak. Also having been born. The last sister was born in the same year I was born, 1 year later. So my cousin Luba, who now lives in Latvia, Riga, because the Soviets sent her and one of the older brothers to Latvia and Riga. And so they too have their story, but they departed after finishing their education in Soviet Ukraine. They were assigned to the Latvian Republic to work on the railway in Latvia, and they live now in Riga and outside of Riga. So that's one of the Petryshyn's cousins. Oh, sorry, that's one of the Zelinsky. Zelinsky, they're not a Petryshyn. Okay, so my mother and father end up in southern Germany, and across all of Germany are millions of refugees, and they are being clustered into what are called displaced persons camps, DP camps. And I was called a DP kid. When I arrived in Canada, kids on the street would say, "You're a DP, aren't you?" And I would say, "Do you know what that means?" Because they meant it as a epithet. They wanted to demean me. They were trying to use it as a slur. And I would laugh at them. What are you saying? You don't even know what you're talking about. So this is kind of the environment, DPs. Well, these DP camps, they're, Yuri Bozic has written a history in English of the DP camps. I recommend that I may show it to you in my next installment, more of these books, so that you can actually see the books, what they look like for anybody watching this film in the future. It'd be easier just to locate such a book. 50 years from now, it's not going to be so easy to find these publications. But anyway, they'll probably all be digitized online and so on. But the camps were, initially they were a mixture of all kinds of people, because there were Poles, there were Belarusians, there were Ukrainians, there were Soviets who had, because, you know, a lot of Soviets went over to the German side during the war, millions of Soviet soldiers. In fact, there was a whole army that the Nazi Germans had funded a Russian army to fight on the German Nazi side against the Soviet Union. That was how much the Soviet Union was aided, even by the Russians themselves. So all of these people showed up in Germany, and they had to be fed and housed and clothed. And so camps began to form, and they started using ex-military barracks that were whipped up where German soldiers had been billeted, you know, earlier. But all those temporary military institutions were empty because people were at the war, at the front. And so the Germans began to put people, group them into these barracks. And once these formed, they would set up a kitchen and cooking, and, you know, they would feed them all together. Because individuals, you know, some individuals could live individually. There were some people who had money, or who had an apartment in Germany, or had friends who, you know, who had given them something. They could live separate from the camps. But I would say the vast majority of the people ended up living in these camps. Now, you could leave the camp, you weren't trapped, you were a free citizen and so on. And people did in these places. For example, they would, you know, some people had a chemistry background, so they would make soap, for example. And they would take it out into the city proper and sell it on the black market, or trade it for cigarettes. And they'd bring the cigarettes back to the camp and make more soap, and then trade cigarettes for a piece of meat. You know, there's a black market economy. You have to put yourself in this context if you want to understand the stresses that people were living in, and how they're powerful these traumas were in their lives, and how they carried over to their children, because all of these stories are then told, you know, 10 years down the line when they're settled, over kitchen tables in Canada. And so you know, and letters come from Ukraine only later, and how my generation, that 10, 15,000 kids, how quite a number of us are trying to put these stories together. We're trying to create an understanding of how this all worked, how it fit together, what we were told in school, what we saw on television, what we saw in Canadian newspapers and so on. It didn't make sense to our friends. Our friends didn't understand this because they never went through the war. Well, I'm sorry, Canadians went through the war, but and many lost their family members. I'm not trying in any way to diminish this, but Canada was not invaded. Canadians did not have to flee to a foreign country. Their families continue to live in their homes in Canada, although members of their families went overseas to serve. But most Canadians, except the ones that were serving in military and fought in the war, of course, went through equivalent or worse trauma. But the Canadians who continued to live at home and work for the war effort in Canada never personally experienced war. Whereas the people I'm trying to describe personally experienced war. And very often people who experience it don't talk about it to their own generation. Sure, some soldiers will get together and they'll become members of the Canadian Legion and have a few beers together, but they don't talk very often about the reality of war to their own family. Whereas my family experienced the war, and they had, in talking about it, mother and father to each other, there I was listening. And so when they referred to this event or that event, it was transferred to a new generation. So that transfer of knowledge happened to the second generation, and we began to understand the risks that our parents took, how lucky they were to survive, how hard you should work to earn your place and be secure. Security was very important, and I've heard of more on one occasion from people that cannot throw away food. Like, very often you're given food and there's bread and so on. You don't eat the bread, so you just throw it away. And my father-in-law, for example, had this habit. Ivan Kucheryshin, he could not throw away any bread. It's not possible. And throughout his life.